The stagecoach wheels groaned a final, weary complaint as they settled into the frozen ruts of Millbrook's Main Street. For Rachel Brooks, the sound was one of grim finality. She gathered her worn woolen shawl tighter, her hands resting protectively over the pronounced swell of her belly. Through the grimy coach window, the town looked like a sketch drawn in charcoal and snow. Log buildings with steep roofs huddled together against the encroaching might of the mountains, their peaks already brushed with the deep purples of twilight. A raw wind swept down from those peaks, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a bitter night. One by one, the other passengers disembarked. Men in heavy coats who gave her sideways glances. Women who pulled their children closer as if her condition were a contagion. Rachel waited until last, her movements slow and deliberate. When she finally stepped down onto the hard-packed earth, the cold seized her breath. She clutched her small valise, the entirety of her worldly possessions, and felt the faint crinkle of the $17 in her pocket. It was a sound both pathetic and terrifying. Her first stop was the Millbrook Inn and Saloon, a 2-story building with light spilling from its lower windows and the distant, tinny sound of a piano. A sign creaked on its hinges, promising warm beds and hot meals. Hope, a fragile and foolish thing, fluttered in her chest. A woman with a face like a tired apple, her hair pulled into a severe bun, met her at the inn's front desk, Mrs. Henderson, according to the ledger open before her. "A room for the night, please," Rachel said, her voice steadier than she felt. Mrs. Henderson's eyes did a swift, unforgiving inventory: the cheap, worn dress, the absence of a wedding band on her left hand, and the impossible-to-hide truth of her pregnancy. The woman's expression did not become cruel, but rather hardened into a kind of weary resolve. "I am sorry, miss, we have no rooms available." The lie was as plain as the dusting of flour on her apron. The key rack on the wall behind her held at least a dozen keys. "I can pay," Rachel insisted, her hand moving toward her pocket. "Just for one night. It is getting terribly cold." "The gold prospectors have taken every last cut," Mrs. Henderson said, her gaze fixed somewhere over Rachel's shoulder. "Even the tailors at the general store have men sleeping on their floor. There is nothing in Millbrook. Perhaps you should have stayed on the coach until Denver." The dismissal was absolute. There was no arguing with a wall of propriety. Rachel felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She knew what they saw, not a woman in need, but a fallen woman, a problem to be swept away before it sullied the town's good name. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and turned away. The piano music from the saloon seemed to mock her with its forced cheer. Back on the street, the wind was sharper, the darkness deeper. The windows of the shops were like judgmental eyes, through the large pane of the tailor's mercantile. She saw Mrs. Taylor whispering to a customer, both of them casting glances her way. She saw the town's physician, Dr. Albright, step out of his office and give her a look of professional pity before hurrying on his way. In the fading light, she saw a large, well-dressed man with a pious expression, Matthew White, the owner of the largest ranch in the valley, watch her from the steps of the land office. He did not offer help. His stare was one of condemnation, as if she were a blight upon his orderly world. She walked the short length of the town, past the blacksmith's forge, now dark and silent, and the sheriff's office, where a single lamp burned. She considered knocking on Sheriff Nelson's door, but what could she say that it was a crime for a town to have no heart, that a woman carrying a child deserved shelter from a coming frost? Pride, stubborn and foolish, held her back. She would not beg, not yet. The sun bled out behind the mountains, leaving a bruised violet sky. The cold began to settle in earnest, a deep, penetrating chill that went straight to the bone. Frost started to feather the edges of the wooden boardwalk. Rachel knew the danger. She had grown up in the East, but she had heard stories of the mountain winters here, of how quickly the temperature could drop, of how unforgiving the night could be to the unprepared. The life inside her gave a gentle kick, a reminder of her responsibility. It was not just her own life she was gambling with. She found a small measure of shelter on the leeward side of the livery stable. Out of the worst of the wind, the smell of horses and hay was earthy and comforting. She sank down onto a discarded bale of straw, pulling her shawl over her knees, and surrendered to a wave of despair. She had thought Millbrook was a new beginning. It was just another ending. She closed her eyes, picturing the face of the man who had promised her everything and left her with nothing but $17 and a life sentence of shame. A sound made her eyes snap open, the soft crunch of boots on frozen ground. A figure emerged from the deepening shadows at the edge of town, a man walking down from the mountain trail. He was tall, broader than any man she'd seen that day, and he moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed at odds with his size. He wore buckskins and a heavy fur coat, and a dark beard covered the lower half of his face. As he drew closer, she saw the rumors of the town given form. This was him, the Mountain Man, Brian Jones. The whispers on the stagecoach had been vivid. He lived alone in a cabin miles up the mountain. Some said he had killed a man over a claim. Others that he had fled a darker past back east. They called him a hermit, a savage, a man best left alone. He stopped a dozen feet from her, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He did not seem surprised to see her there, huddled and shivering. His eyes, in the gloom, were unreadable. "You will not last the night out here," he said. His voice was a low rumble, deeper than she expected, and held no trace of malice. It was a simple statement of fact. Rachel instinctively pulled her shawl tighter. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She was alone, vulnerable, with a man the entire town feared. "The inn is full," she managed to say, her teeth chattering. "The inn is never full for people with money and a good name," he corrected, his tone flat. "You are short on one and out of the other." He was not being cruel, merely honest. "The temperature will drop another 20 degrees before dawn. That wind will cut right through that shawl." She stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was a monster of rumor and speculation, yet his words were practical, sensible. He shifted his weight, and the rifle he carried in the crook of his arm became more visible. "I have a cabin," he said, nodding toward the dark mass of the mountain that loomed over the town. "It is warm. There is a fire." The offer hung in the air between them, stark and unbelievable. The town, with its church and its sheriff and its veneer of civilization, had turned her away. Now, the outcast, the rumored killer, was offering sanctuary. It made no sense. Why, she asked, the word a small puff of white vapor. He considered the question for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over her, from her worn boots to the weary lines around her eyes, resting for a second on the swell of her belly. "Because no one," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, "should freeze to death at the foot of my mountain." This was her choice, a slow, certain death in the respectable cold of the town, or an uncertain life with the man they all feared. She thought of the small, persistent flutter of life within her. That life deserved a chance, no matter how slim, no matter how frightening the path. The town had passed its judgment. Perhaps it was time she made her own. She looked into his eyes, searching for the monster she had been warned about. She saw stillness. She saw a deep, abiding loneliness that mirrored her own. She saw, perhaps, a flicker of something she could not name, something that was not a threat. Slowly, using the livery wall for support, she pushed herself to her feet. "All right," she whispered. He gave a single, curt nod, as if he had expected no other answer. He turned and started toward the mountain trail without another word, trusting her to follow. Rachel took one last look at the lights of Millbrook, a town that had offered no warmth, and then turned her back on it. She picked up her valise and followed the large, silent man into the darkness. The climb was harder than anything she had ever known. The trail was little more than a goat path, winding steeply upwards through pine and bare aspen. The air grew thinner, colder. Her lungs burned with every breath, and the muscles in her legs screamed in protest. The weight of her child felt immense, a leaden anchor pulling her down. Brian Jones moved ahead of her with an unnerving, silent ease. He never seemed to look back, yet he set a pace she could just barely manage. He was a part of the mountain, as sure-footed as the deer whose tracks they occasionally crossed. He did not speak, and for that, Rachel was grateful. There was no breath for words, only for the desperate work of survival. They reached a point where the trail narrowed to a treacherous ledge. On one side, the mountain rose up in a sheer wall of rock. On the other, a black, dizzying drop. A section of the path ahead was coated in a treacherous sheath of ice, gleaming like polished obsidian in the faint starlight. Fear, raw and absolute, seized her. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. One slip, one misstep, and it would all be over. Brian stopped as well, turning to face her. He stood on the far side of the icy patch, waiting. He watched her, his expression hidden by the deep shadows of the night. He made no move to come back for her, no move to rush her. He simply waited, giving her the dignity of her own fear. He could easily cross back, grab her arm, and pull her to safety. It is what any other man would have done, a gesture of ownership disguised as help. But Brian did not. He waited until she met his gaze, until her panic had subsided into a grim resolve. Only then did he extend his hand. It was a large, calloused hand, a woodsman's hand. But the gesture was not one of command. It was an offer, plain and simple. Rachel looked at the hand, then back to his shadowed face, in that small act of patience, in that quiet show of respect for her will. A seed of trust, small and fragile, began to sprout in the frozen ground of her heart. She took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. She reached out, and her cold fingers closed around his. His grip was firm, steady, and surprisingly warm. He did not pull her. He simply held on, a solid anchor in a world of ice and darkness, and let her find her own footing as she carefully shuffled across the dangerous patch of trail. Once they were both on solid ground, he released her hand without a word and continued up the path. They climbed for what felt like an eternity more. Then, through the trees ahead, a light appeared. Not the cold, distant light of a star, but the warm, golden flicker of a lamp in a window. It grew brighter as they approached. The heart of a small log cabin tucked into a clearing. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a silent, welcoming plume against the ink-black sky. It was the most beautiful thing Rachel had ever seen. It was hope, made of wood and fire and stone. They reached the door, and Brian put his hand on the latch. For a moment, he paused, and in the spill of light from the window, she saw him look down at her, a question in his eyes. He had brought her this far. The final step was still hers to take. She gave another small nod, and he pushed the door open, revealing a simple room filled with the life-saving warmth of a blazing hearth. From a distant ridge, a solitary figure watched the light in the cabin window flare to life. Red Hawk, a warrior of the Ute, had seen the pregnant woman stumbling through the town. He had seen the mountain man lead her away. He lingered for a moment, his face impassive, before melting back into the silent, watchful darkness of the forest. The first morning in the cabin, Rachel woke to a profound silence. It was not the empty, menacing silence of the previous night, but a deep, peaceful quiet, broken only by the soft hiss and crackle of a well-tended fire in the hearth. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by a gentle, pervasive warmth. She was lying on a simple straw mattress near the fire, covered by a thick buffalo robe. Sometime during the night, Brian must have placed it over her. She sat up, her body stiff and sore from the climb. The cabin was a single, large room, meticulously clean and spare. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Shelves holding tin plates and a few provisions lined one wall. On the other side of the room was a larger bed, neatly made, which was clearly his. He was nowhere to be seen. A pot of coffee sat warming on the hearth, and a plate with 2 biscuits and a piece of jerky was on the table. A rhythm established itself in the days that followed, a quiet routine built on unspoken understanding. Brian would be gone before the sun crested the eastern peaks, the sharp ring of his axe sometimes echoing from the deep woods, or the muffled report of his rifle rolling down the mountainside. He would return at dusk, a brace of rabbits or a grouse slung over his shoulder, his face impassive, his movements weary but efficient. He would clean his kill outside, stack firewood by the door, and then come in to sit by the fire, rarely speaking unless spoken to. Rachel, in turn, found her own purpose. She could not be a simple guest, a burden. She began by sweeping the wooden floors and washing the few dishes. She found a sewing kit in an old tin box and mended the tear in her shawl. Then, gathering her courage, she took one of his flannel shirts that had a frayed collar and repaired it with small, neat stitches. When he returned that evening, he picked up the shirt, looked at the repair, and then looked at her. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was thanks, acceptance, and permission all in one. She learned about him in pieces, through the evidence of his life. He was a man of order and habit. His tools were clean and sharp, his rifle meticulously oiled. But the greatest surprise was a small shelf of books tucked away in a corner. They were not the Bibles or almanacs one might expect. There was a worn copy of Emerson's essays, a volume of Thoreau's writings on nature, and a book of poetry by a man named Whitman. The discovery was a quiet shock. The town saw a brute, a savage. The book spoke of a man with a rich, contemplative inner life. One evening, after a particularly silent meal of rabbit stew, he rose from the table, took the Emerson book from the shelf, and sat in his chair by the fire. He did not seem to be ignoring her, but rather retreating into a familiar comfort. The silence stretched, thick with things unsaid. "May I?" Rachel asked, her voice soft, gesturing toward the other books. He looked up, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "They are not much," he said, his first unsolicited words to her in days, but they passed the time. She selected the Thoreau, its cover softened with use. She took the other chair, on the opposite side of the hearth. The fire danced between them, a warm and living barrier. They sat that way for hours, the only sound the whisper of turning pages and the sigh of the wind in the pines outside. The silence was no longer awkward or empty. It was filled with a shared, quiet communion. A fragile peace began to settle in Rachel's heart. She was safe. For now, that was enough. After a week, their supply of flour and coffee had dwindled. "We need to go to town," Brian announced one morning, his voice a low rumble that startled her out of her thoughts. A knot of anxiety tightened in Rachel's stomach. The memory of the cold stares, the whispered judgments, was still fresh. "I can stay here," she offered. "No," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It is better if they see us together. Let them talk. Hiding makes it look like there is something to hide." His logic was stark and undeniable. He was not ashamed of her presence in his cabin, and he would not allow her to be ashamed either. It was, in its own way, a profound act of defense. The walk down the mountain was different in the daylight. The sun was bright on the snow-dusted peaks, the air so clean it was like drinking cold water. Brian pointed out the track of a deer, the winter den of a bear, the high nest of an eagle. He spoke of the mountain not as a thing to be conquered, but as a living entity to be understood and respected. Their arrival in Millbrook shattered the morning's peace. As they walked down the main street, every activity seemed to pause. Windows suddenly needed cleaning. Horseshoes required inspection. They were the center of a silent, powerful vortex of curiosity and condemnation. Mrs. Henderson swept her front steps with a furious energy, never once meeting their eyes. At Taylor's Mercantile, the air grew thick with disapproval. Mrs. Taylor, A woman whose face was perpetually pinched with worry served them with a stiff, formal courtesy that was colder than any outright insult. Her husband watched them from behind a stack of barrels, his arms crossed. Then Matthew White entered the store. He was a large man, made larger by a thick wool coat and an air of unshakable self-importance. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose wealth and piety gave him the authority to pass judgment on lesser mortals. He saw Rachel standing beside Brian, and a look of deep, righteous disgust settled on his face. "Seems the mountain is attracting all sorts of vermin these days," White said, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. He was not looking at them, but at Mr. Taylor. A man cannot be too careful about the company he keeps. It reflects on the whole town. Rachel felt the heat of shame rise in her cheeks. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. But Brian stood unmoved. He did not turn to face White. He did not raise his voice. He simply continued with his transaction as if the man did not exist. "A sack of flour, Mrs. Taylor," he said, his voice calm and even. "And salt, coffee, and a strip of licorice, if you have it." He placed the coins on the counter, his movements deliberate. The simple act of ignoring White was more powerful than any angry retort. It robbed the man of his audience and his power. White, sputtering with indignation, saw that his pronouncement had failed to find purchase. He huffed and turned his attention to a display of expensive cigars. When their supplies were bagged, Brian took the heavy sack himself. As they were about to leave, he turned back to the counter, picked up the single strip of black licorice, and handed it to Rachel. It was a small thing, a child's treat, but in that moment, in that place, it felt like a declaration. In the face of the town's scorn, he had offered her a moment of simple sweetness. Her throat tightened with an emotion she could not name. They walked out of the store and back into the cold sunlight, the whispers resuming behind them. She had never felt so much pride in a man's quiet dignity. The trail back up the mountain felt steeper, the load of supplies and the town's ill will weighing them down. They entered a narrow part of the path where high granite walls rose on either side, creating a natural canyon. The air was still and cold. Suddenly, a sound split the silence. It was a high, chilling scream, a sound of pure predatory fury that echoed off the rock walls. Rachel froze, her blood turning to ice. On a ledge of rock not 30 feet above them, a puma materialized. It was a sleek, powerful creature, all coiled muscle and lethal grace. Its long tail twitched, and its yellow eyes were fixed on them with a terrifying intensity. Instinctively, Brian shoved Rachel behind him, his body a solid shield. He swung the heavy sack of flour off his shoulder and raised his rifle in a single, fluid motion. There was no panic in him, only a focused, deadly calm. He was a man meeting a familiar danger on its own terms. He sighted down the barrel, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, another shot cracked through the canyon, the sound sharp and impossibly loud. The bullet did not strike the puma. It slammed into the rock face just to the side of the animal's head, sending a spray of granite chips into the air. The puma, startled by the sound and the impact, let out an enraged snarl. It was not wounded, but it had been unequivocally warned. With a final, hateful glare, it leaped from the ledge, its body a tawny blur, and vanished into a crevice in the rocks. Brian slowly lowered his rifle, his eyes scanning the opposite side of the canyon. A figure stepped out from behind a thick stand of aspen. He was tall and lean, dressed in tanned deer hides, and he held a rifle in his hands. It was the Ute warrior Rachel had glimpsed on her first night, the man the townsfolk called Red Hawk. He stood perfectly still, his face a mask of stone, his black hair long and unbound. His gaze was not on Rachel, but on Brian. The two men looked at each other across the canyon, the space between them charged with a silent, crackling energy. They were two kings in their own respective kingdoms, acknowledging a border. Brian did not raise his rifle again. He did not shout or make any threatening gesture. He simply stood his ground. And then, After a long moment, he gave a slow, deliberate nod of his head. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of a shared code. Red Hawk held his gaze for another second before mirroring the nod, a gesture just as slight, just as freighted with meaning. He had not saved them out of friendship. He had enforced the law of the mountain. The puma was his to hunt or to spare. This was his territory, and they were merely passing through. Then, as silently as he had appeared, Red Hawk stepped back into the trees and was gone. The canyon was once again quiet, but the silence felt different now, filled with the presence of an unseen guardian. They did not speak of the incident for the rest of the way back to the cabin. There were no words for what had passed between the two men. It was a language older than any town, a treaty written in nods and rifle shots. The following afternoon, while Brian was out checking his trap lines, Rachel felt a need to escape the confines of the cabin walls. The air was crisp and clean, and she walked slowly around the small dwelling, her hands resting on her belly. Tucked behind the cabin, almost hidden by a dense growth of pine, she found a small, windowless shed. The door was not latched. A wave of curiosity, stronger than her sense of propriety, washed over her. She pushed the door open. It swung inward with a soft creak. The air inside was cool and smelled richly of pine resin and freshly cut wood. It was a workshop. Wood shavings littered the floor in neat curls. A variety of saws, chisels, and planes hung in orderly rows on the wall. It was as tidy and purposeful as the cabin itself. On a sturdy workbench in the center of the shed sat a half-finished project. Rachel stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. It was a piece of pale, smooth pine, and Brian had been carving into it. She reached out and traced the lines with her fingertips. They were not rough, masculine carvings of animals or geometric shapes. They were the soft, curving lines of a flower, a rose, its petals unfolding with an impossible delicacy. She could see the incredible skill in every cut, the patience in every smoothed edge. Beside the piece of wood lay a small, sharp carving knife, its blade gleaming. It was a tool of creation, of beauty. She did not know what he was making. She could not yet see the final shape, but as she stood there, in the quiet solitude of his hidden workshop, she understood that she knew even less about this man than she had thought. The town saw a killer. She had seen a reader, a protector, and now, an artist. And in the face of all the town's ugly certainty, this beautiful, inexplicable mystery was the most hopeful thing of all. Trust, she realized, was not given. It was built, one small, quiet act at a time. The snow began as a whisper, a few lazy flakes drifting down from a sky the color of old pewter. By midday, it was a silent, determined siege. By nightfall, the whisper had become a roar. The wind howled down from the high peaks, a physical force that rattled the single window of the cabin and drove snow into every tiny crevice of the log walls. The world shrank until it was nothing but the four walls of the cabin, the steady warmth of the fire, and the two quiet people within it. For 3 days, the storm raged. They were utterly cut off, suspended in a white, roaring eternity. The snow piled up against the door, burying the window until only the top few inches were visible, admitting a pale, ghostly light. Their routine, already spare, was distilled to its essence. Brian would venture out only as far as the woodshed, returning covered in snow, his arms laden with firewood. They ate their simple meals of smoked meat and the last of the biscuits, and in the long hours of twilight that passed for both day and night, they sat by the fire and read. The silence between them was no longer a space to be filled, but a presence in itself, a shared territory. Rachel found herself watching him, the way the firelight caught the planes of his face, the quiet competence of his large hands as he cleaned his knife or added a log to the fire. The town's caricature of a brutish hermit had long since faded, replaced by the reality of a man who was profoundly still, his depths hidden but certainly not empty. Still, a deep-seated anxiety gnawed at her. She was a guest, a temporary refugee. The storm would eventually break, the snow would melt. And then what? She could not stay here forever, a dependent, a constant reminder of the charity that had saved her. The thought of returning to the world outside, to the cold judgment of towns like Millbrook, was a physical pain. She was a burden, and the weight of that knowledge was heavier than the child she carried. She saw the careful way he rationed their food, the extra wood he had to chop, and her shame was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. Brian, for his part, seemed lost in his own thoughts. He was more withdrawn than usual, his gaze often fixed on the fire, his expression unreadable. Rachel wondered if he was regretting his decision, if the reality of having another person in his small, ordered world was becoming a strain. She feared he was simply waiting for the weather to clear so he could politely, but firmly, send her on her way. The thought filled her with a dread that was colder than the storm outside. He had saved her from the frost, but what would save her from the life that awaited her afterward? On the fourth morning, Rachel awoke to a change. The relentless howling of the wind had subsided to a low moan. The world was no longer shaking. A profound quiet had fallen, the deep, muffled silence of a world buried in snow. And in that quiet, she heard a new sound. It was faint, rhythmic, coming from outside, a soft, scraping sound. Shave, pause, shave, pause. Curiosity, quiet and insistent, pulled her from her bed. The fire had been banked for the night, and the air in the cabin was cold. She pulled on her boots and wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The sound was coming from the direction of the small workshop she had discovered. Brian's bed was empty. He must have risen before her, somehow clearing a path through the deep snow. She moved to the cabin door, her heart beating a little faster. She felt like an intruder, a spy. But the need to understand, to solve the puzzle of this man, was overwhelming. She slowly, carefully, lifted the latch. The door opened with a soft groan. A wall of snow, 4 feet high, blocked the exit, but a narrow trench had been shoveled from the doorway to the workshop, its sides clean and sharp. The air was bitingly cold, but still, the storm had passed. Light spilled from a crack in the workshop door, a warm, yellow line against the blue-white of the snow. She crept along the shoveled path, her stockinged feet making no sound. The rhythmic scraping was louder now, accompanied by the gentle rasp of a small saw. She reached the door and hesitated. This was his private space, his sanctuary. But she had to know. She put her eye to the narrow crack between the door and its frame. The sight within stole her breath. The workshop was lit by 2 lanterns, casting a warm, golden glow over the scene. Brian stood at his workbench, his back to her. He was not wearing his heavy coat, in just his shirt sleeves. The powerful muscles of his back and shoulders moved with a focused, fluid grace. He was bent over his work, his entire being concentrated on the object before him. He was not carving a simple flower this time. He was building something. He worked with a surgeon's precision. He planed a long, curved piece of wood, his movements smooth and economical, checking the curve with his eye, running his calloused hand over its surface to feel for imperfections. He fitted it to a frame, tapping it into place with a small wooden mallet. The shape was becoming clear now, and Rachel's mind reeled with the impossibility of it. He was making a cradle. It was small, designed to be rocked with a foot from a chair beside it. The side panels were already in place, and on one of them, she could see the rose he had been carving, now complete, a thing of breathtaking beauty and life. He was not just building a piece of furniture, he was pouring his soul into it. He finished with the rocker and turned his attention to the interior. He unrolled a bundle from the corner of the shed. It was a stack of rabbit pelts, the ones she had seen him skinning and tanning with such care. She had assumed they were for a new coat or for trade. She was wrong. He took one of the pelts, its fur thick and white and impossibly soft, and began carefully fitting it to the bottom of the cradle. He was not just making a bed for a child, he was making a warm, soft nest. Rachel pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. The cold of the morning, the anxieties of the past weeks, the deep, aching fear for her future and her child's, it all dissolved in a hot, overwhelming wave of emotion. She had seen herself as a stray dog he had taken in out of pity, a temporary problem to be managed. But this was not the work of a man fulfilling a reluctant duty. This was an act of profound, deliberate hope. He was not just giving her shelter from the storm. He was building a place for her child in his world. He was building a future. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. Then another, and another. She sank back against the cold logs of the workshop, her legs too weak to hold her. The truth of it, the sheer, staggering kindness of it, broke over her. She married the mountain man nobody wanted, then learned he'd been building a cradle. The vow was not one spoken before a preacher, but one made in the silent, steady work of his hands. He was a man who spoke not with words, but with wood and tools and patience. He had built her a sanctuary, and now he was building one for her child. She stayed there for a long time, watching him work, until her tears subsided and a quiet, unshakable resolve settled in her heart. She was not a burden. She was the reason for this beautiful, hopeful thing. The knowledge was a foundation, solid and true, on which she could finally build a life. She waited until she heard his tools fall silent, until she heard him moving about, cleaning his workspace. Then she pushed herself to her feet and walked back to the cabin, her mind clear for the first time in months. She stoked the fire, put the coffee on to boil, and set about making breakfast, her movements filled with a new and certain grace. He came in a few minutes later, brushing the snow and wood shavings from his clothes. He looked tired, but a deep, quiet satisfaction radiated from him. He avoided her eyes, as he often did, and went to wash his hands in the basin. She let the silence sit for a moment, the familiar, comfortable quiet of their mornings. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the table. He sat, cradling the warm tin cup in his hands. "Brian," she said, her voice soft but steady. He looked up, and for the first time, his gaze did not slide away. He met her eyes, and she saw the question there, the flicker of his own uncertainty, his own fear of unworthiness. "When the snow melts," she began, and saw his expression tighten, bracing for the words he expected to follow. He thought she was going to announce her departure. "I want to stay," she said. It was not a plea. It was not a question. It was a simple statement of fact, a truth laid bare between them. "If you will have us, my child and I, we want to stay." He did not speak. The town's rumors, the ghosts of his past, the deep-seated belief in his own isolation, she saw it all flicker in his eyes. He stared at her, and in his gaze, she saw a man looking at a future he had never dared to imagine for himself. The silence stretched, and for a terrifying second, she thought she had misread everything. Then, slowly, the tension in his shoulders eased. The guarded, lonely look in his eyes softened, replaced by a light she had never seen before. It was a look of profound, bone-deep relief. He did not smile, not with his mouth, but his eyes did. He gave a single, slow nod, and in that simple gesture, a new world was born. The storm was over, both outside and in. The sun was rising, casting a brilliant, hopeful light across the endless, silent snow. The heavy silence of the snowbound world gave way to the sound of dripping water. The great storm had broken, and a reluctant spring was beginning to assert its claim on the mountains. Sunlight, thin but persistent, found its way through the pines, and the deep drifts of snow began to shrink and sag. With the melting of the snow came a new and pressing reality: the baby was coming soon. There were things they needed, things Brian's solitary life had never required. Soft flannel for swaddling, oil for the baby's skin, and other small necessities Rachel listed on a piece of scrap paper. The decision to go to town was not made lightly. The cabin had become a world unto itself, a fortress of quiet understanding. To leave it was to re-enter the world of judgment and suspicion. But their purpose was no longer about survival. It was about preparation. It was about a future. "We will go together," Brian said, his voice leaving no room for discussion. It was the same simple statement he had made before, but this time it felt different. It was not a man defending a stranger, but a man standing with his family. As they made their way down the mountain, the world felt new. The path was slick with mud and melting ice, and Brian's hand was a steady presence at Rachel's elbow, guiding her over the treacherous spots. They did not speak much, but the silence was comfortable, filled with the shared purpose of their journey. Rachel's hand rested on the swell of her belly, a gesture both protective and proud. The shame that had once clung to her like a shroud had been burned away by the warmth of the cabin's hearth and the steady, quiet work of Brian's hands. Their arrival in Millbrook was met with an even deeper chill than before. If their first appearance together had been a curiosity, this one was a scandal confirmed. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were low, condemning murmurs. Eyes followed them from the saloon, from the front porch of the inn, from behind the curtains of the houses that lined the street. They were an affront to the town's carefully constructed order. At Taylor's Mercantile, the air was thick with a cloying, false piety. Mrs. Taylor's face was a mask of strained civility. She gathered the items on Rachel's list, her movements stiff and precise, placing each one on the counter as if it were contaminated. "Flannel," she said, her voice thin and clipped. "And oil. I suppose you will be needing these things soon." The emphasis she placed on the words was a judgment in itself. It was then that Matthew White entered, his presence sucking the air from the small store. He saw them standing at the counter, saw the small pile of baby things, and his face darkened with a look of righteous fury. He strode forward until he was standing directly beside them, though he addressed himself to the entire room. "This is a disgrace," he announced, his voice booming with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "An absolute disgrace to this decent, God-fearing community." He turned his gaze on Rachel, his eyes sweeping over her with open contempt. "To parade your shame so openly, and you," he said, rounding on Brian, his voice dripping with scorn, "to take this fallen woman into your home. It is one thing to live like a savage in the mountains, but to bring your depravity down here, to taint our town, is another matter entirely." Brian did not rise to the bait. He stood still and silent, a bulwark of calm against White's storm of indignation. He placed a few more coins on the counter for a bag of beans. The lack of reaction only seemed to infuriate White more. "And what of the child?" he bellowed, his voice rising. "What chance does an innocent babe have in such a place, raised in a sinner's den by a woman of no morals and a man who is little more than a beast? I tell you, it is a dangerous environment for a child." The words struck Rachel like a physical blow. To have her fitness as a mother questioned, to have her unborn child used as a weapon against her, was an agony beyond words. But as she looked at Brian's steadfast profile, she felt a surge of strength she did not know she possessed. She was not the same frightened woman who had huddled by the livery. She lifted her chin and met White's furious gaze without flinching. "This man," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence of the store, "has shown me more Christian decency than I have seen in this entire town. My child will be raised with kindness and honor, things you clearly know nothing about. Mr. White." A collective gasp went through the few other customers in the store. To speak so plainly to the most powerful man in the valley was unheard of. White's face turned a mottled shade of red. He looked as if he might strike her. Brian moved then, a small, almost imperceptible shift of his body that placed him more fully between Rachel and White. "We are finished here," he said, his voice a low growl. He gathered their purchases. "The authorities will be hearing about this," White sputtered, his threat hanging in the poisoned air. We will see what the law has to say about a child being raised in such circumstances." They walked out of the store, the weight of the town's hatred pressing in on them. But this time, they walked side by side, a united front against the world. Instead of turning toward the mountain path, Brian led them to the small, clapboard building that served as the sheriff's office. Sheriff Nelson was a man in his 50s, with a weary face and eyes that had seen too much of the petty cruelties of men. He was polishing a shotgun when they entered, and he looked up with a sigh, as if he had been expecting them. "Heard some shouting from down the street," the sheriff said, putting his cloth aside. "Figured it involved one of you, or both." "Matthew White was making threats," Brian said plainly. "He spoke of getting the law involved, said my home is a dangerous place for a child." Sheriff Nelson leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. "Matthew White owns half this valley. Brian, he sits on the town council and is the biggest contributor to the church fund. His opinion carries weight, whether it is right or wrong." "It is wrong," Rachel said firmly. "I might believe that, ma'am," the sheriff said, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "But the law is a complicated thing. It is about appearances as much as truth. White is painting a picture of you two, a wild mountain man and a disgraced woman. He will say he is acting out of concern for the child." On the wall behind the sheriff's desk, a new notice was tacked up. It was a poster, printed with official lettering, announcing that a survey team from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad would be working in the area to map a potential route through the mountains. Rachel's eyes lingered on it for a moment, a symbol of a larger world, of a progress that felt both distant and menacing. "What can we do?" Brian asked. "For now, nothing," Sheriff Nelson said, his voice grim. "He has not done anything illegal. He is just using his mouth. My advice to you is this: be careful. Live quietly. Do not give him or anyone else in this town a single thing they can use against you, because he will be looking for it, and he will find people to listen to him." The walk back up the mountain was heavy with the weight of the sheriff's warning. The threat was no longer just a matter of whispers and cruel words. It had the potential to become something official, something that could tear their small, fragile world apart. They were halfway to the cabin when a figure stepped onto the path ahead of them. It was Red Hawk. He was not carrying his rifle this time, only a long, beautifully crafted bow. He stood silently, watching them approach. Brian stopped, giving the Ute warrior a nod of respect. Rachel stood a little behind him, her apprehension mixed with a strange sense of calm in the man's presence. Red Hawk's gaze was fixed on Brian. He did not seem to notice Rachel. "The snow melts," he said, his voice low and resonant, like the sound of stones rolling in a deep river. "The water runs different this season." Brian's eyes narrowed slightly. "I have noticed. Men have been at the timberline," Red Hawk continued, his gaze drifting up toward the high peaks. "They carry tools that are not for hunting or trapping. They put marks on the trees. They drive stakes into the earth." He looked back at Brian, his dark eyes intense. "They are planning a new path for the Iron Snake. Their line cuts through the place where the she-bears birth their young. It crosses the river where the salmon spawn." He did not need to say the word railroad. His meaning was perfectly clear. This was his land, and he knew every change, every disturbance, every intrusion. "White's land sits in the low valley," Brian said, more to himself than to the Ute. "The easiest path for a railroad." "The path they mark now," Red Hawk said, "avoids the big ranch. It climbs, it cuts through my people's sacred ground, and it cuts across the foot of your mountain." The implication was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Someone, likely Matthew White, was using his influence to divert the railroad, pushing it through protected Ute territory and Brian's land to benefit his own. It was a new, far greater threat, one made of money and steel and the relentless force of a changing world. Red Hawk held Brian's gaze for a long moment. "The mountain will not suffer a wound like that quietly," he said. "It was not a threat, but a statement of fact, a law of nature." He then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and stepped off the path. vanishing into the deep woods as silently as a shadow. Back in the cabin, the warmth of the fire could not dispel the chill of the day's encounters. The cradle stood in the corner, a testament to a future that now seemed perilously uncertain. The threat from the town was a personal venom, aimed at their character. The threat of the railroad was something larger, more impersonal, a force that could grind their world to dust without ever knowing their names. That evening, in the Millbrook saloon, Matthew White held court. He bought a round of whiskey for a half-dozen men, prospectors and ranch hands who were always eager for a free drink. "It is a matter of public decency," White said, his voice filled with a convincing, sorrowful gravity. "That poor child, born into such a situation, we, as a community, have a moral obligation to see that it is raised in a proper Christian home." He passed a piece of paper and a pen down the bar. "Just a simple petition," he explained, "to show the territorial judge that we are concerned citizens, that we believe the child's welfare must be protected." One by one, under the influence of free whiskey and the powerful sway of Matthew White's certainty, the men signed their names. They were not evil men, for the most part, but they were weak men, men who preferred to follow rather than think, men who found it easier to believe a simple, ugly story than a complicated, inconvenient truth. And with each signature, the net around Rachel and Brian and their unborn child grew tighter. The last days of April were a time of profound transformation. The mountain was shrugging off its heavy winter cloak. The sound of running water was everywhere, a constant, cheerful gurgle as meltwater trickled down the slopes, swelling the creeks. The south-facing hillsides were dotted with the brave green of new growth, and the air, once sharp and sterile, now carried the damp, earthy scent of awakening soil. The world felt pregnant with possibility, mirroring the heavy, waiting state of Rachel's own body. Her days were slow, a cycle of small domestic tasks punctuated by long periods of rest. She would sit on the small bench Brian had built by the cabin door, her hands folded over the taut drum of her belly, feeling the powerful, rolling movements of the life within. A deep, instinctual calm had settled over her. The cabin was her sanctuary, Brian her steady anchor. The fears that had once haunted her had receded, replaced by a quiet, fierce anticipation. The first pain came in the dead of night. It was a low, deep clench that pulled her from a restless sleep. She lay still in the darkness, breathing through it, waiting. When a second one followed 20 minutes later, she knew the time had come. She rose quietly. Not wanting to wake Brian, she moved to the hearth, adding a few small logs to the glowing embers. Her movements slow and deliberate, but he was a light sleeper, attuned to the slightest change in the cabin's rhythm. "Rachel!" His voice was a low rumble from the other side of the room. "It has started," she said, her own voice sounding surprisingly calm. In an instant, he was up, pulling on his boots. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not panic. A quiet, focused energy came over him. He moved to the window and looked out. The moon, which had been bright an hour earlier, was gone, obscured by a sudden, thick bank of clouds. A wet, heavy snow had begun to fall, the flakes large and sloppy, already plastering themselves against the glass. A late spring storm, fickle and dangerous, was closing in around them, sealing them off from the world once more. The mountain was reminding them that they were utterly on their own. A wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over Rachel. There would be no Dr. Albright from town. Not that she would have wanted him. There was only Brian, a man who knew trees and traps, not childbirth. But as she watched him, her fear began to subside. He moved with a calm, methodical purpose that was immensely reassuring. He filled the large kettle and hung it over the fire to boil. He took the soft flannel they had bought in town and, using his sharp skinning knife, cut it into clean squares. He took down his small, precious collection of books and pulled one from the bottom. It was not Emerson or Thoreau. It was a plain, leather-bound volume, The Homesteader's Guide to Practical Medicine. He opened it to a marked chapter. His brow furrowed in concentration as he quickly scanned the pages on childbirth, his lips moving slightly as he reread the familiar words. He had been preparing for this, just as he prepared for winter or any other challenge the mountain threw at him. As the pains grew stronger, more frequent, Rachel retreated into a world of sensation. The cabin, the falling snow, Brian's quiet movements, they all faded into the background, replaced by the all-consuming, primal work of her body. She paced the floor. She leaned against the rough-hewn table. She knelt on the bearskin rug before the fire, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Brian was a constant, steady presence. He said little, but he was always there, handing her a cup of water, wiping her brow with a cool, damp cloth. He spoke to her not with platitudes, but with the quiet language of action. He was a rock in the swirling vortex of her pain. At one point, he went to the door, perhaps to gauge the depth of the snow. When he came back in, he was holding a small leather pouch tied with a deerskin thong. It had been left on the stoop, a silent offering in the midst of the storm. He opened it, and the scent of dried herbs, of mint and sage and something wild and unfamiliar, filled the air. "Red Hawk," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He held the pouch for a moment. Then, without hesitation, he tossed a handful of the leaves into a pot of boiling water. A fragrant, calming steam rose into the air, cutting through the sharp scent of sweat and fear. He soaked a cloth in the infusion and placed it on her forehead. The warmth, the wild, clean scent, seemed to seep into her, lending her a strength that was not her own. It was a gift from the mountain itself, a sign that they were not entirely alone. The hours blurred. The storm outside and the storm within her raged in unison. There came a point when exhaustion began to overwhelm her. The pains were relentless, one crashing upon the next, and yet nothing seemed to be happening. A dark despair began to creep into the edges of her mind. She was failing. She was not strong enough. "I cannot do this," she sobbed, her body trembling with fatigue and fear. "Brian, I cannot." He came to her then, kneeling in front of her. He took her hands in his grip firm and grounding. His large, calloused thumbs stroked the backs of her hands. He looked directly into her eyes, and in his gaze, there was no fear, only an unshakable belief in her. "Yes, you can, Rachel," he said, his voice low and steady, a calming anchor in her sea of pain. "I read in the book. It says that sometimes the baby needs to turn. It says you are stronger than you think. Now you listen to my voice, just my voice. Breathe with me. That is all you have to do. Breathe." And she did. She focused on his voice, on the steady rhythm of his breathing, on the solid pressure of his hands. He was her lifeline. He coached her through each contraction. His words simple, practical, drawn from the pages of his book and from some deeper, innate well of wisdom. He was no longer just a woodsman. He was her partner, her guide. He was the father of her child. And in that moment, he was everything. With a final desperate cry that seemed to tear itself from her very soul, the struggle was over. It was followed by a sudden, shocking silence. And then a new sound filled the cabin, a thin, wavering, but furious cry, a cry of indignant, vibrant life. Rachel fell back against the pile of furs Brian had arranged, her body limp, her mind reeling. Through a haze of exhaustion and tears, she saw him. He was holding their child, a tiny, red, squirming creature, in his enormous hands. He handled the baby with a reverence and a gentleness that was breathtaking to behold. He cleaned her with the warm, herb-infused water, his movements clumsy but effective. "A girl," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard before. "Rachel, we have a little girl." He wrapped the baby in a piece of the soft flannel and brought her to Rachel. She reached out, her arms trembling, and took her daughter. She was so small, so perfect, A thick tuft of dark hair, a tiny, wrinkled face, 10 perfect fingers that grasped at the flannel. An overwhelming wave of love, fierce and primal, washed through Rachel, sweeping away all the pain, all the fear. She was a mother. The word was a revelation, a new and permanent part of her soul. Victoria, Rachel whispered, the name coming to her as if from a dream. A victory for the life they had saved, for the family they had made. Later, after Rachel had rested and the baby had nursed for the first time, Brian rose and went to the corner of the cabin. He came back with the cradle. He placed it beside Rachel's bed, the carved rose on its side seeming to glow in the soft firelight. With an infinite tenderness, he took the sleeping baby from Rachel's arms and laid her down on the soft rabbit fur lining. The cradle, which had been a promise of a future, was now a reality. A perfect fit. As dawn approached, the snow stopped falling. The wind died down. A pale, watery light began to filter into the cabin. Outside, the world was pristine and new, hushed under a fresh blanket of white. But the sun was already climbing, and the sound of dripping water had begun anew from the eaves. The storm had been a final, desperate gasp of a dying winter. Spring had truly arrived. Brian sat in the chair by the hearth, not reading, not working, just watching the cradle as it gently rocked. His large frame, which had once seemed so intimidating, was now the very definition of protection. He was a guardian, a father. A family was not made with a preacher's words or a piece of paper from the town clerk. It was forged here, in the heart of a storm, built with courage and trust, and the steady, quiet work of a good man's hands. The weeks that followed Victoria's birth were a time of quiet wonder. The cabin, once a solitary man's refuge, was now filled with the small, essential sounds of a new life, the baby's soft coos, her indignant cries when she was hungry, the gentle creak of the cradle as Rachel rocked it with her foot. A new rhythm had taken hold, a domestic harmony that felt as natural and as ancient as the turning of the seasons. Brian was transformed. The quiet, solitary man was now a father, and the role settled on him as comfortably as his worn buckskin coat. He would return from his hunting, lay his rifle aside, and go straight to the cradle, his large, rough fingers stroking the baby's soft cheek with a look of profound, heart-stopping tenderness on his face. This fragile peace was interrupted one bright afternoon in late May by the sound of an approaching horse. It was an unfamiliar sound. The only visitor they ever had was the silent, fleeting presence of Red Hawk. Brian, who had been splitting wood, straightened up, his hand resting on the handle of his axe, his body tense and watchful. Rachel came to the doorway, holding Victoria, a sense of unease prickling her skin. The rider who emerged from the pines was a stranger. He was a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, dressed not in the rough clothes of a prospector but in a well-tailored traveling suit that spoke of city life. He had a handsome, open face, dark hair, and a smile that seemed to come easily. He rode a fine-looking bay mare, and he handled it with an effortless confidence. He reined in at the edge of the clearing, his eyes taking in the scene, the cabin, the stacked firewood, Brian standing like a guardian, and Rachel in the doorway with the baby. The stranger dismounted, his movements graceful. "Quite a place you have got here," he said, his voice friendly and laced with a charm that felt entirely alien in this wild setting. "I was told I might find Brian Jones up this way." Brian did not relax his stance. "Who is asking?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of suspicion. The young man's smile widened. He swept his hat from his head. "It has been a long time, brother," he said. "I suppose I cannot blame you for not recognizing me." Brian stared, his face a mask of disbelief. The axe slowly lowered to his side. "Jerry," he said, the name a hoarse whisper. "In the flesh," the young man said, spreading his hands, "all the way from California." The reunion was not one of effusive hugs and backslapping. It was a thing of quiet, stunned moments and long, searching looks. The two men were a study in contrasts. They shared their mother's dark hair and strong jawline, but that was where the resemblance ended. Brian was the mountain, solid, weathered, and deeply rooted. Jerry Morales was the river, fluid, fast-moving, and polished by his journey through a wider world. He was Brian's younger half-brother, the son of their mother's second marriage after their father had passed. That evening, as they sat around the fire, the story of the intervening years came out, a bitter argument after their mother's death, rooted in grief and misunderstanding, had sent Jerry west to seek his fortune in the goldfields of California, while Brian, seeking solace from a world that no longer made sense, had retreated further into the mountains. Jerry's eyes, full of a warmth that was impossible to distrust, kept drifting to Victoria, who was asleep in her cradle. "I heard things in town, Brian," he said softly. "Ugly things. About you, about her." He nodded toward Rachel, his expression one of sincere respect. "They have got it all wrong, do they not?" Brian simply looked at Rachel, and the look that passed between them was answer enough. Jerry's presence acted as a bridge to the world they had shunned. A few days after his arrival, he rode down to Millbrook alone. He did not seek out conflict. Instead, he bought a round of drinks at the saloon, his pockets flush with California gold. He was a gifted storyteller, and he spoke of his and Brian's childhood, of hunting trips and fishing contests, of their mother's kindness. He did not defend Brian, he simply humanized him. He painted a picture not of a reclusive monster, but of a quiet, capable older brother who had always been more comfortable with trees than with people. He spoke with an easy charm and a sincerity that was difficult to dispute. The men in the saloon, who had been so quick to sign Matthew White's petition, began to shift uncomfortably. The simple, ugly story they had been told was becoming complicated. But as one threat began to recede, another, far more formidable, advanced. The railroad survey team arrived. They set up a temporary office in a rented room at the inn, their presence official and impersonal. They were men of compasses and transit levels, men who saw the land not as a living entity, but as a series of grades and elevations to be conquered by iron and steam. Soon, the evidence of their work began to appear on the mountain. Brightly colored flags on thin wooden stakes began to sprout from the ground, marking the proposed route. They marched up the slope in a relentless, unswerving line. Rachel would see them from the cabin, small, jarring notes of color against the deep greens and browns of the forest. They were like cuts on the skin of the land, the harbingers of a deep and permanent wound. One afternoon, Brian and Jerry walked the line of stakes. It made no sense. The route climbed the steepest part of the slope, a place of rock falls and treacherous inclines, a route that would require massive trestles and deep cuts into the mountainside. "Look," Jerry said, pointing down into the valley. "The logical path is down there, through the flatlands." The flatlands, of course, belonged almost entirely to Matthew White. His ranch spread across the valley floor, a vast and profitable enterprise. The survey line, for some inexplicable reason, made a wide, difficult detour around his property. "He is behind this," Brian said, his voice a low, angry growl. "He is using his influence to push them up here, to save his own land at the expense of everyone else's." Their suspicions were confirmed a few days later. Jerry, whose friendly demeanor gave him access to the town's gossip, learned that White had sold a small, seemingly worthless parcel of rocky land high on the mountain to the railroad company for an exorbitant price, positioning himself to profit from the very route he was forcing upon them. He was not just protecting his ranch. He was exploiting the mountain, the Ute territory, and Brian's homestead for his own enrichment. The petition, the moral outrage, it had all been a smokescreen, a way to discredit the man whose land stood in the way of his greed. They knew they could not fight this alone. A homesteader's claim and the town's shifting opinion were no match for the combined power of Matthew White's money and the railroad's relentless advance. They were trapped between a man's greed and the faceless might of progress. It was Red Hawk who showed them a third way. He appeared one evening at the edge of the clearing, not as a fleeting shadow, but as an emissary. He carried a single eagle feather in his hand. He looked at the stakes dotting the hillside, then at Brian. "The iron snake will poison the water and scare the game," he said, his voice flat and hard. "My people have seen this before. The land dies where it crawls." "It is white," Jerry said. "He is pushing them this way." Red Hawk nodded, his eyes like chips of obsidian. The man with the loud voice and the hollow heart. But the railroad does not care about his heart. They care only about the straightest line and the cheapest land. "This is not the straightest line," Brian countered. "Nor the cheapest." "Then we must show them a better one," Red Hawk said. "My chief will speak with you. He will speak with the man who respects the mountain, and his brother who speaks the white man's clever words. Come." He led them not up the mountain, but along a hidden game trail that ran parallel to the slope, into the heart of Ute territory. They arrived at a small, well-hidden encampment of hide lodges nestled in a grove of ancient cottonwoods by a clear, fast-running creek. It was a place of deep peace and quiet dignity. They were brought before the chief, an old man named Ure, whose face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles and wisdom. He sat before his lodge on a buffalo robe, his back straight, his gaze clear and penetrating. He listened without speaking as Red Hawk explained the situation in his own language. Then the chief looked at Brian and Jerry. He spoke in slow, careful English. "You live on the mountain," he said to Brian. "You take only what you need. You do not scar the earth. We have watched you." Then his gaze shifted to Jerry. "You have a smooth tongue, but your eyes are honest. You speak for your brother." "We speak for our home," Jerry said. "And for the mountain. We do not want to see it destroyed, but we know we cannot stop the railroad alone." "One man cannot stop a river," the chief said with a nod, "but many stones can change its course." For the next hour, they talked. It was not a conversation of anger or threats, but a practical, strategic discussion. They spoke of land rights, of treaties broken and promises forgotten, but mostly, they spoke of a different kind of future. Ure, the chief, was a pragmatist. He knew, as they did, that the railroad was inevitable. The goal was not to stop it, but to control it, to shape it into something that could serve the community instead of simply exploiting it. An idea began to form, a bold and unexpected proposal. It was Jerry, with his understanding of the world beyond the mountains, who articulated it. "We do not refuse them a path," he said, his voice filled with a newfound conviction. "We offer them a better one, a partnership." They would propose a new route, one that followed the lower valley but skirted the edges of White's prime grazing land. A compromise that was both practical and just. In exchange for this undisputed right-of-way, the railroad would be bound by an agreement. They would not cut through the Utes' sacred burial grounds. They would hire local men, both from the town and from the Ute tribe, to work on the construction and to monitor the environmental impact. A small percentage of the revenue from the transport of ore from the mines would be paid into a community fund, overseen by a council that included the sheriff, a town representative, and a member of the Ute tribe. It was a revolutionary idea. It was a demand that progress come not as a conqueror, but as a partner, with responsibilities as well as rights. It was a way for the people of the valley, both white and Ute, to have a say in their own destiny. When they had finished, the old chief was silent for a long time. He looked at the creek, at the mountains that were his home, at the two white men who had come to him not as enemies, but as allies. "It is a good plan," he said at last. "It is a path that walks through the hearts of the people, not just over their land. We will stand with you." As they left the UT camp, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. The conflict was far from over. Matthew White and the faceless men in the survey office were a formidable force. But Brian and Jerry were no longer just two men fighting for a small piece of land. They were part of an alliance, forged in a shared respect for the mountain and a common desire for justice. Brian was no longer an outcast, and he was no longer alone. The alliance with Ore and his people had planted a seed of hope, but it was a seed planted in dry, hostile ground. Jerry made a formal presentation of their proposal to the railroad's chief surveyor, a humorless man named Mr. Egan, whose only interest was in a completed map and a signed contract. Egan was non-committal, but Jerry's well-reasoned arguments, backed by the implicit threat of a protracted legal and physical battle over Ute treaty lands, had clearly given him pause. The railroad did not want complications. It wanted clear title. Matthew White, however, was not a man who yielded gracefully. He saw the shift in the town's mood, the new respect in the eyes of some for the Jones brothers. He saw his carefully constructed narrative of the savage mountain man beginning to crumble. His petition, once a tool of moral certainty, was now a source of embarrassment for some who had signed it. Cornered and enraged, his piety curdled into a dark and desperate malice. If he could not remove Brian Jones with the law, he would remove him with fire. It started on a hot, dry afternoon in early summer, when the winds blew down from the high country, hot and restless. The forests were tinder dry, a landscape waiting for a spark. The first sign was a smell on the wind, a faint, resinous acridity that was not the familiar scent of a campfire. Brian was the first to notice. He was on the cabin stoop, sharpening an axe, when he lifted his head and sniffed the air, his body going unnaturally still. "What is it?" Rachel asked from the doorway, Victoria asleep in a sling strapped to her chest. "Smoke," he said, his voice a low growl. "And it is in the wrong place." He climbed to the small rocky outcrop behind the cabin that gave him a view of the lower slopes. A plume of dirty gray smoke was rising from the forest, miles below them but directly above the town of Millbrook. Then, as he watched, a second plume erupted, a few hundred yards from the first, and then a third. "It is no accident," he said when he returned, his face grim, his eyes hard as flint. "Lightning does not strike 3 times in a clear sky." Jerry, who had been checking on his horse, came running. "I can see it from the clearing. The wind is carrying it straight for the town." There was no debate, no discussion. An unspoken understanding passed between the three of them. This was not their fight alone, but they were the mountain's first line of defense. Rachel ran inside, grabbing canteens of water and wrapping a loaf of bread in a cloth. Jerry saddled his mare. Brian grabbed 2 axes and a shovel. They were a small, determined army moving to meet a monstrous enemy. By the time they reached the lower slopes, the 3 small fires had merged into a single, roaring front. It was a living thing, a hungry beast that devoured the dry underbrush with a terrifying, crackling roar. The wind whipped the flames into a frenzy, sending showers of glowing embers arcing through the air, starting smaller spot fires ahead of the main blaze. The heat was a physical blow, and the smoke was a choking, blinding fog. They were not the only ones. A small, disorganized group of men from the town had come up the path, their faces a mixture of fear and grim determination. Sheriff Nelson was there, trying to shout orders over the din. The Taylor brothers, the blacksmith, a few prospectors. They were armed with shovels, buckets, and a desperate courage. It was Brian and Jerry who brought order to the chaos. "Buckets are no good," Jerry yelled, his voice cutting through the noise. "We need a fire break, a wide one, down to the mineral soil." As Jerry began organizing the townsmen, directing them with a clear-headed authority, Brian met another figure who had emerged from the smoky woods. It was Red Hawk, his face streaked with ash, his eyes burning with a cold fury. He carried an axe, and a half-dozen Ute warriors, equally grim and determined, were with him. This fire was an invasion of their land as much as Brian's. There were no words exchanged between Brian and Red Hawk. There was no need. They looked at each other, then at the fire, and then at a natural ridge that ran a few hundred yards ahead of the fire's path. It was the only defensible position. They gave a simultaneous nod and went to work, their axes rising and falling in a powerful, synchronized rhythm. They were not white man or Ute. They were woodsmen, and the fire was their common enemy. Rachel, with Victoria still sleeping soundly against her chest, saw the terrified faces of the few women who had followed their husbands up the trail. Mrs. Henderson from the inn and Mrs. Taylor from the mercantile stood huddled together, their faces pale with fear. The town's children were with them, their eyes wide with terror. Rachel's own fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but the sight of the children, the memory of her own helplessness on her first night in Millbrook, ignited something fierce within her. She was not a victim anymore. She was a mother, and this was her home. "We are no good to them here," she said, her voice clear and strong, startling the other women. "We need to get the children down to the creek bed. It is the safest place, and the men will need water, all the water we can carry." The women stared at her for a second. Then, seeing the unshakable resolve in her eyes, they nodded. A new purpose galvanized them. Rachel led them to the safety of the shallow creek, organizing the children, calming their fears with a gentleness that belied the terror of the situation. Then she organized the women into a water brigade. They filled every bucket, every canteen, every spare pot, and began the grueling work of hauling water up the smoky slope to the men who were desperately clearing the firebreak. Rachel, even with the baby strapped to her, worked alongside them, her face smudged with soot, her arms aching, her resolve like iron. The work on the fire line was brutal, hellish. The heat was scorching, the smoke a constant torment. Men hacked at trees and tore at the undergrowth, their lungs screaming for air, their muscles burning with exhaustion. Brian and Red Hawk were the heart of the line, their axes felling pines with a speed and precision that was awe-inspiring. Jerry moved along the line, directing the men, shoring up weak spots, his energy seemingly limitless. The townspeople, who had once whispered about the savage mountain man and the heathen Ute, now fought shoulder to shoulder with them. They saw Brian, his face a grim mask of determination. "Pull, mister. Taylor back from a collapsing, burning tree." They saw Red Hawk, moving like a phantom through the smoke. "Show a young prospector how to use a wet blanket to beat back the encroaching flames." The prejudices of a lifetime were being burned away in the heat of the fire, replaced by a raw, desperate, and profound respect. As night fell, the scene became even more terrifying. The fire was a roaring, 50-foot wall of orange and red, a stark and terrible beauty against the blackness of the night. It lit the smoke-filled clearing with a ghastly, flickering light. The firebreak was nearly complete, a wide, raw scar of earth. But the wind was picking up, pushing the flames ever closer. Embers rained down around them, starting small fires that had to be frantically stomped out. It was a race against time, a battle for the soul of the town that lay sleeping and vulnerable just down the slope. It was in this chaotic, hellish light that the truth was finally illuminated. A man, his face crazed with fear and drink, stumbled out of the woods on the far side of the firebreak. He was not one of the firefighters. He was trying to flee, to get around the fire and back to the town. In his hand, he clutched a torch, a thick bundle of oil-soaked rags wrapped around a stick. It was no longer lit, but the end was still blackened and smoking, a wisp of greasy smoke curling from its tip. Sheriff Nelson saw him first. "You there, stop," he yelled. The man panicked. He threw the torch and bolted, but he was clumsy, and Jerry, who was nearest, tackled him in a flying leap. They went down in a tangle of limbs. Sheriff Nelson retrieved the torch. He held it up for all to see. The smell of kerosene was unmistakable. "This fire was set," he said, his voice raw with fury. He hauled the captured man to his feet. It was a ranch hand, a known associate of Matthew White. "Who paid you?" the sheriff demanded, his face inches from the man's. The man, his courage gone, began to sob. "White," he whimpered. "Matthew White. He paid me and 2 others. He said to make it look like the mountain man did it, or the Indians. He wanted them gone. He wanted the whole mountain to burn." A stunned, horrified silence fell over the firefighters. They looked from the sputtering arsonist to Brian and Red Hawk, who were still working, their faces grim, their axes still swinging, trying to save the very town that had been so quick to condemn them, the sheer, naked evil of White's plan. Exposed in the light of the fire he had started was a shocking, sickening revelation. At that moment, a great gust of wind hit the fire line. A tall, burning pine tree groaned, leaned, and then crashed down across the firebreak, showering the town side of the trench with a sea of sparks and embers. The fire had jumped the line. A collective cry of despair went up from the men. They were beaten. The town was lost. But Brian and Red Hawk did not hesitate. They leaped over the smoldering log, into the breach, into the shower of fire. Using green pine boughs they had set aside, they began beating at the new flames, a desperate two-man army against a sea of fire, inspired by their impossible courage. Jerry and the other men surged after them, their exhaustion forgotten, their spirits reignited. They fought for another hour, a wild, desperate battle in the smoke and darkness. And then, as if the mountain itself had finally decided to intervene, the wind shifted. It turned back on itself, pushing the fire back into the already burned-over area. A few fat, blessed drops of rain began to fall, hissing as they hit the hot embers. It was over. The firebreak had held. The town was safe. In the gray, smoky light of the false dawn, the firefighters stood, leaning on their tools, their bodies battered, their faces black with soot. They were a single, unified entity, no longer separated by race or reputation, but bound together by the shared trauma and triumph of the night. They looked at the smoldering, blackened landscape, then at the intact roofs of Millbrook below. And then they looked at Brian Jones and Red Hawk, the two outcasts who had led them, who had saved them. And for the first time, they saw them not as threats, but as heroes. The truth, finally, had been revealed. Not by words, but by the undeniable, incandescent light of action. The exhaustion that followed the fire was a physical ache, a deep weariness that settled in the bones of every man, woman, and child in Millbrook. The immediate threat was gone, but a heavy pall of smoke and shock hung over the valley. The scorched earth on the mountainside was a stark, black wound, a constant reminder of how close the town had come to annihilation. In the days that followed, a cold, persistent rain began to fall, turning the ash to a greasy slick and the dirt roads to a thick, clinging mud. It was as if the sky itself were weeping for the wounded land. The atmosphere in the town had undergone a seismic shift. The whispers about Brian Jones had ceased, replaced by a low, angry murmur directed at Matthew White. The captured arsonist was in Sheriff Nelson's jail, and the other two had been quickly rounded up. The story they told was damning. A sordid tale of whiskey and silver coins exchanged for a promise to burn the mountain and frame an innocent man. Matthew White had locked himself away in his large, empty ranch house. He was a pariah in the town he had once ruled through fear and piety. His power had been built on a foundation of perceived righteousness, and with that foundation shattered, he had nothing left. His followers had abandoned him. His authority had evaporated, and he was left to marinate in his own bitter humiliation. At the cabin, a quiet, watchful peace had returned. The ordeal had forged an even deeper bond between them. Jerry, no longer just a visitor, was now an integral part of their small family. His easygoing nature a welcome counterpoint to his brother's stoicism. Rachel watched the two of them, saw the easy camaraderie and deep, unspoken affection, and felt a sense of completeness she had never imagined possible. They were a fortress, not of wood and stone, but of loyalty and love. One evening, as the cold rain drummed a steady, melancholy rhythm on the roof, they sat by the fire. Victoria was asleep in her cradle, her tiny face serene. The mood was somber, reflective. The violence of the fire and the ugliness of White's treachery still lingered in the air. A sound from outside cut through the drumming of the rain, a clumsy, stumbling noise. The sound of someone fighting their way up the slick, muddy path. It was followed by a loud, incoherent curse. Instantly, Brian was on his feet, his body coiled with a familiar, watchful tension. Jerry rose with him, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt revolver he now wore holstered at his hip. "Stay here," Brian said to Rachel, his voice a low command. He took a heavy iron poker from the hearth and moved to the door. "Brian, be careful," she whispered, her heart suddenly pounding. He unlatched the door and pulled it open just a crack, framed in the opening. Illuminated by the flickering lamplight was Matthew White. He was a terrifying sight. His fine clothes were soaked with rain and smeared with mud. His face, usually so composed and self-assured, was contorted into a mask of pure, insane rage. A wild, unkempt beard shadowed his jaw, and his eyes were bloodshot and crazed. An empty whiskey bottle dangled from one hand. A large, heavy dragoon revolver was clutched in the other. He was no longer a pillar of the community. He was a cornered animal, rabid and unpredictable. "You Jones!" he roared, his voice a ragged, drunken bellow. He raised the revolver, its massive barrel wavering unsteadily. "You ruined me, you and your harlot and that half-breed brother of yours. You turned my own town against me." Brian did not move. He stood in the doorway, the fire poker held loosely at his side, his body a calm, solid barrier between the madman and his family. "Go home, White," he said, his voice cold and even. "It is over." White laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "It is not over until I have wiped your stain from this mountain. I built this town. I gave it order. I gave it decency, and you brought your filth into it." He took a stumbling step forward, raising the gun until it was pointed squarely at Brian's chest. The hammer of the big revolver was already cocked, a black and menacing crescent in the dim light. Rachel, watching from the shadows of the room, felt a scream rise in her throat, but it was choked off by pure terror. The world seemed to slow down, to narrow to the space between the two men, to the dark, round hole of the revolver's muzzle. It happened in a blur of motion. Jerry, who had moved silently to the side of the doorway, stepped into the opening. His own revolver was in his hand, and he fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space of the porch. It was not a wild shot. It was a single, deliberate, and precise act. White cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain and surprise. The dragoon revolver flew from his grasp, clattering onto the muddy ground. He staggered back, clutching his right shoulder, a dark stain already spreading through the sodden fabric of his coat. He stared at Jerry, his face a mask of disbelief, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed into the mud. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain and the heavy, panting breaths of the two brothers. Then Rachel was there, running out onto the porch, her mind screaming. Victoria, awakened by the gunshot, had begun to wail from her cradle inside. "Is he—" Rachel could not finish the sentence. "I shot him in the shoulder," Jerry said, his voice tight, his face pale but resolute. He was going to kill him. "Rachel, I had no choice." Brian knelt beside the fallen man. White was unconscious, his breathing shallow. The wound was bleeding freely, a dark, pulsing stream that mingled with the rain and the mud. Brian looked at the man who had tried to destroy them, who had tried to kill him just seconds before. He saw the hatred, the envy, the pathetic, ruined face of his enemy. Then, without a word, he turned to Rachel. "Get me a cloth," he said, "and the whiskey from the shelf, not the good stuff." Rachel stared at him, uncomprehending. "What are you doing?" "He is bleeding out," Brian said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "If we do not stop it, he will die right here." He was not looking at a monster anymore. He was looking at a wounded man. In that moment, with his would-be murderer lying helpless at his feet, Brian's own humanity asserted itself, absolute and unshakable. He would not let White die in the mud. He would not become the thing White had accused him of being. Rachel, understanding the profound, unspoken principle at stake, ran back inside. She returned with a strip of clean linen and the bottle of cheap whiskey. Brian poured the raw spirit over the wound, and White, even in his unconsciousness, moaned and twitched. Then, with a surprising gentleness, Brian packed the cloth into the wound and, using strips torn from White's own ruined shirt, fashioned a tight pressure bandage. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. The journey down the mountain was a grim, arduous ordeal. They fashioned a crude travois from 2 poles and a blanket and loaded the unconscious White onto it. Brian took the front, Jerry the back, and they began the slow, treacherous descent down the slick, muddy path. Rachel followed behind, carrying a lantern, her heart a heavy, aching weight in her chest. They arrived in Millbrook near midnight, a strange, silent procession emerging from the rainy darkness. The town was mostly asleep, but a light was still burning in the sheriff's office. Sheriff Nelson's jaw dropped when they half-carried, half-dragged the mud-caked, groaning form of Matthew White through his door. "What in God's name happened?" the sheriff demanded. "He came to our cabin," Jerry said, his voice weary but clear. "He was drunk. He had a gun. He was going to shoot Brian. I shot him first." He laid his revolver on the sheriff's desk. It was self-defense. The sheriff looked from Jerry's earnest face to Brian's grim, stoic expression, then down at the groaning, pathetic man on his floor. He had known this was coming. He had known White's festering hatred would eventually erupt into violence. He sent for Dr. Albright, who came, grumbling, and patched up White's shoulder with a professional but unsympathetic air. As the doctor worked, the sheriff took their statements. He wrote everything down in his slow, methodical hand, his face impassive. Just as he was finishing, the door opened. Mr. Taylor from the Mercantile stood there, a lantern in his hand, his face etched with worry. "I saw the lights," he said. "I heard you had brought White in." He looked at Brian and Jerry, and the look in his eyes was not one of suspicion, but of a deep, troubled respect. "Sheriff," he said, his voice heavy, "if it comes to a trial, if this man says anything against them," he nodded toward the brothers. "I was there on the fire line. I saw what they did. I will speak for them. So will a dozen other men." He was followed a few minutes later by the blacksmith, and then by 2 of the prospectors who had fought the fire. One by one, the men who had once shunned Brian Jones came to the sheriff's office in the dead of night, their consciences stirred, ready to stand as witnesses. The final witness was brought from the jail cell in the back. The captured arsonist, his face pale with fear, looked at White, who was now conscious and slumped in a chair, cradling his bandaged arm. "Is that the man who paid you to set the fire?" Sheriff Nelson asked, his voice like iron. The arsonist, his eyes wide, nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice trembling. "That is him. That is Mr. White." The community, which had once been White's greatest weapon, had turned decisively and irrevocably against him. The rumors he had spread were ash, and the truth, forged in fire and confirmed by a gunshot in the rain, had finally been brought to the law. Justice, slow and methodical, had finally come to Millbrook. The weeks following Matthew White's arrest settled into a period of profound and unfamiliar quiet. The rain washed the last of the ash from the air, and the new green of summer began to tentatively reclaim the burned-over hillside. The town of Millbrook was healing, its collective conscience pricked, its social order quietly realigning itself around a new, more honest center. White was gone, taken by a federal marshal to stand trial in Denver, his ranch left in the hands of a court-appointed administrator. The dark cloud of his influence had finally lifted. At the cabin, the peace was deep and restorative. The rhythms of life were no longer dictated by fear or uncertainty, but by the simple, demanding needs of a growing baby and the steady work of homesteading. Brian and Jerry worked together with an easy, unspoken synergy, repairing the sections of the mountain path damaged by the fire and planting a small vegetable garden for Rachel. Victoria grew stronger each day, her dark eyes following her father and uncle with a solemn curiosity, her sudden, gurgling laughs filling the small cabin with a joy it had never known. Rachel watched it all, her heart so full it felt as if it might burst. She had arrived in this valley a broken, desperate woman, a piece of driftwood tossed on a hostile shore. Now, she was the heart of a home, the center of a family. She had found not just a sanctuary, but a life, one built not on promises but on shared hardship, mutual respect, and 1,000 small, unspoken acts of kindness. One evening, after Jerry had gone to his bedroll in the small lean-to he had built, Rachel and Brian sat on the bench outside the cabin door. A vast, silent canopy of stars glittered in the clear mountain air. Victoria was asleep inside, her soft breaths a gentle counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. The silence between them was no longer a space of caution, but one of deep, abiding comfort. Rachel looked at Brian in the soft starlight. The hard lines of his face were softened. He was gazing out at the dark, powerful silhouette of the mountains, his home, his sanctuary. She saw the quiet strength in him, the unshakable integrity that had been her salvation. She thought of his hands, hands that could fell a tree or gentle a newborn, that could build a cradle and tend a wound. She thought of his eyes, which had looked at her without judgment when the rest of the world had seen only shame. She had been the recipient of his quiet grace for so long. She had been given a home, a family, a future she had never dared to dream of. Now, it was her turn to be the builder. It was her turn to make a choice, to act, to forge the final, binding link in the chain of their lives. "Brian," she said softly, her voice steady in the quiet of the night. He turned to look at her, his expression questioning. "I was thinking," she continued, her gaze direct and clear, "that this is a fine place to raise a family, that this is a good life. The only thing it is missing is a preacher's blessing." He stared at her, his mind slowly working through the implications of her words. He was a man accustomed to solitude, a man who had never expected such things for himself. Rachel reached out and placed her hand over his. "Will you marry me, Brian Jones?" she asked. The words were simple, direct, stripped of all artifice. It was not a plea for validation or a request for security. It was an offer of a shared future, made between equals. It was her choice, her declaration. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. A slow, profound wave of emotion washed over his features. It was not the wild joy of a young lover, but the deep, soul-shaking relief of a man who had long believed himself to be an island, only to discover that he was, and always had been, part of a continent. He did not speak. He could not. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. Then, he gave a single, slow nod. It was the same gesture he had used to affirm her staying, but this time it held the weight of a sacred, final vow. The next day, two separate but intertwined futures were being formalized. While Rachel and Brian were making plans for their quiet wedding, Jerry rode down to Millbrook for a meeting that would determine the fate of the entire valley. The meeting was held in Sheriff Nelson's office. It was a small, somber gathering. Mr. Egan, the chief railroad surveyor, was there, his face as impassive as ever. But his eyes held a new, grudging respect. Jerry sat opposite him, calm and well-prepared. Sheriff Nelson presided, his presence lending a quiet, legal authority to the proceedings. And in the corner of the room, standing straight and silent, was Red Hawk. He was not there as a petitioner, but as a sovereign, a representative of a people whose claim to this land was far older than any surveyor's map. Jerry laid out their proposal again, not as a demand, but as a sensible, mutually beneficial business arrangement. He had maps, drawn by Brian, showing the alternate route, A path that was not only less destructive to the land, but also, as he proved with a set of carefully calculated figures, more cost-effective to build. He spoke of the local workforce, men who knew the land and were eager for honest wages. He spoke of partnership, of a railroad that could be a force for shared prosperity rather than a tool of exploitation. Mr. Egan listened, asking sharp, practical questions. He was a man of numbers and engineering, not of sentiment, but Jerry's logic was undeniable. The fire, and the revelation of White's treachery, had made the company deeply wary of the original route. A legal battle with the Ute, combined with the fierce opposition of a now unified town, would mean costly delays. This new proposal offered them a clean, efficient, and peaceful path forward. Finally, Egan gave a curt nod. The company finds these terms acceptable, he said. He slid a prepared document across the table. It was a memorandum of understanding, outlining the key principles of their agreement. The new route, the hiring of local labor, with a specific clause guaranteeing a share of the jobs to the Ute. A commitment to environmental oversight, with a council to be formed as they had proposed. Sheriff Nelson read the document carefully, then nodded his approval. Jerry signed his name with a confident flourish. Mr. Egan signed his signature, a precise, angular scrawl. Then, the sheriff pushed the document and the inkwell toward Red Hawk. Red Hawk did not take the offered pen. Instead, he reached into a small pouch at his belt and took out a lump of reddish-brown clay. He mixed it in his palm with a few drops of water from his canteen, creating a thick, earthy paste. Then, with a quiet dignity that filled the small room, he pressed his open palm firmly onto the bottom of the document, leaving a perfect, vivid handprint in red earth. It was a signature of the land itself, a bond far older and more sacred than any written word. The treaty was sealed. 3 days later, a traveling Methodist preacher, a thin, earnest man named Reverend Miller, made his way up the mountain path on a tired-looking mule. He had been surprised by the request, but Sheriff Nelson had assured him it was a union the entire town now stood behind. The wedding was as simple and as beautiful as the life they had built. It was held in the clearing in front of the cabin, under the vast, benevolent blue of the Colorado sky. The only guests were Jerry, who stood as Brian's best man, and Victoria, who watched the proceedings with wide, solemn eyes from a blanket on the ground, occasionally letting out a happy gurgle. The scorched hillside in the distance was not a scar, but a backdrop, a testament to the fire they had walked through together. Rachel wore her best dress, a simple calico that she had mended and pressed. Her hair was adorned with a small wreath of wildflowers she had gathered that morning. She had never felt more beautiful, or more certain. Brian stood beside her, looking uncomfortable but resolute in a clean flannel shirt. He was not a man for ceremonies, but he stood tall and proud, his eyes never leaving Rachel's face. Reverend Miller's words were simple, his voice carrying in the clean mountain air. He spoke of partnership, of faithfulness, of building a home in the wilderness. As he spoke, Victoria let out a loud, cheerful coo, as if giving her own blessing to the union. When it came time for the rings, Rachel presented Brian with a simple, unadorned gold band she had purchased on her first, desperate trip to Taylor's Mercantile, a relic of a past life that she now repurposed for a new one. Brian then took her hand. He did not have a gold ring. Instead, he produced a small, perfect ring that he had carved from a piece of mountain mahogany. The wood was a deep, rich red, and he had polished it until it shone with a soft, warm luster. It was a simple, perfect circle, a symbol of a love that was as strong, as patient, and as deeply rooted as the trees from which it was made. As he slipped it onto her finger, it felt more precious to Rachel than all the gold in California. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend said, his face beaming. Brian did not kiss his new wife in a grand, passionate gesture. That was not his way. Instead, he leaned down and pressed a gentle, firm kiss to her forehead. Then he reached down and lifted Victoria from her blanket, holding her up between them. They were a family, complete and whole, bound not just by a preacher's words, but by the unbreakable ties of shared experience, mutual respect, and a quiet, profound love. The community had been healed by the signing of a document. Their family had been healed by the speaking of a vow. The seasons turned, and spring returned to the mountain, not with the hesitant, reluctant thaw of the year before, but with a full-throated, confident rush of life. The creek, fed by the melting snows, sang a boisterous song. The burned-over hillside, which had been a stark, black wound, was now covered in a soft, verdant fuzz of new grass and fireweed, its brilliant magenta blossoms a testament to the land's indomitable power of renewal. Life in the cabin had settled into a rhythm as steady and as natural as the turning earth. The sharp edges of survival had been worn smooth by the daily friction of domesticity, leaving behind a warm, polished grain of contentment. The conflicts that had once defined their existence, the town's scorn, a man's malice, the impersonal threat of progress had receded, melting away like the last of the winter snow. What remained were the small, essential challenges of a life being built, the tilling of a new garden plot, the mending of a fence, the endless, delightful, and exhausting work of raising a child. On a warm afternoon, the kind that smells of sun on pine needles, Brian sat on the porch bench, a block of aspen wood in his lap. He was not carving a rose this time. With the same patient, meticulous skill, he was coaxing the shape of a small horse from the wood. Its head was arched. Its legs were poised for a gallop. Its tiny ears were pricked with a lively alertness. It was a creature of pure, joyful energy, captured in wood by a father's loving hands. At his feet, Victoria, now a sturdy toddler with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin, played with a collection of smooth river stones. She would stack them, watch them tumble, and then let out a delighted, gurgling laugh, the sound as clear and as musical as the nearby creek. She was a child of the mountain, sure-footed and curious, her world a safe and wondrous place bounded by the love of her family. Rachel sat in a rocking chair nearby, a basket of mending in her lap. Though her hands were still, she watched her husband and her daughter, a quiet, profound happiness swelling in her chest. Her hand rested on the gentle, familiar curve of her belly. The cradle, which had stood as a symbol of hope, would soon be needed again. Her journey, which had begun in shame and desperation, had come full circle. She was no longer a woman defined by her past, but a woman firmly rooted in a future she was actively creating. "He's getting faster," she said, her voice soft. Brian looked up from his carving, a rare, small smile touching the corners of his mouth. "He has your knack for talking his way into a good deal." They were speaking of Jerry, true to his word. He had bought a small, struggling ranch in the valley, not the prime land of Matthew White's former empire, but a good piece of bottomland with a solid house and a sturdy barn. With a loan from Jerry's California savings and Brian's knowledge of lumber and livestock, they were turning it into a thriving concern. Jerry, the charming rover, had finally put down roots, becoming a respected figure in the community, his social grace the perfect complement to Brian's quiet competence. He was a frequent visitor to the cabin, his arrival always heralded by a cheerful shout and a bag of treats from town for his niece. Later that afternoon, they had other visitors. A wagon, drawn by 2 sturdy plow horses, made its way slowly up the now well-worn path to the cabin. It was Mr. and Mrs. Taylor from the Mercantile. A year ago, their faces had been masks of pinched disapproval. Now, they were wreathed in genuine, friendly smiles. "We were coming up to check on our woodlot. Mr. Taylor called out, reining in the horses. And Mrs. Taylor here insisted on packing enough food to feed a logging crew. Mrs. Taylor bustled down from the wagon, carrying a large basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Nonsense," she said, her voice warm. "I just knew Rachel would be tired of her own cooking. And I brought something for the little one." She produced a small, beautifully stitched rag doll, which she handed to a wide-eyed Victoria. They spread a blanket in the clearing and shared a meal of fried chicken, potato salad, and fresh-baked bread. The Taylors spoke of the town, of the new schoolhouse being built, of the quiet, steady work of the railroad crews down in the valley. They spoke of the new atmosphere in Millbrook, of a decency that was no longer loud and performative, but quiet and genuine. They did not mention Matthew White by name, but his absence was a palpable presence, a void that had been filled by a healthier, more honest community spirit. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley, Rachel looked down from their perch on the mountain. In the distance, she could see them, the twin steel ribbons of the railroad tracks, but they were not a wound, not a scar. They did not cut a straight, arrogant gash across the land. They curved, a graceful, sweeping arc that followed the contours of the valley, respectfully skirting the foothills of the mountain and the unseen boundaries of the Utes' sacred lands. The tracks were not a symbol of conquest, but of compromise. They were proof that progress did not have to be a destructive force, that the relentless march of the future could be guided by wisdom and respect. That night, after their guests had departed and the cabin was once again filled with a peaceful, familial quiet, Rachel stood for a moment by the cradle. It stood in the corner, its pale wood glowing in the soft lamplight, the rabbit fur lining still soft and welcoming. It had been the first true promise of this new life, a testament to a quiet man's hope. Soon, it would hold a new baby, a new beginning. It was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a repository of their story, a family tree carved from wood. Its roots sunk deep into the rich soil of this mountain. Brian came and stood behind her, his large hands resting gently on her shoulders. They stood in silence for a long time, watching their daughter sleep, listening to the quiet breathing of their home. There were no more dramatic twists waiting for them around the bend, no more villains to be vanquished, no more earth-shaking revelations. The great defining conflicts of their lives were over. Rachel leaned back against him, feeling the steady, reassuring strength of his presence. She understood now that true happiness was not a destination you arrived at after a long and perilous journey. It was not a grand prize won at the end of a battle. It was a quieter, more patient thing. It was the house you built, board by board. It was the fire you tended, log by log. It was the daily, repeated choice to meet the world not with fear, but with courage, responsibility, and a quiet, unshakable love. It was a peace that had been hard-earned, and for that reason, it was a peace that would endure. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.